I've been writing for a really long time. For as far back as I can remember, I have been writing. And not just writing, writing stories, writing fiction, creating characters, sending them on adventures, and writing about what happens to them and the strange and extraordinary things that they get up to. Even before I was writing comics, I was writing stories. In fact, I have entire files full of short stories that I wrote when I was in school. I wanted to talk about a specific aspect of my writing journey that often does not get talked about and is at the heart of some really pressing social concerns at the moment. And it has to do with what we define ourselves as and how we see ourselves. This video could also possibly be titled How Super Commando Dhruv Saved My Life. In case you don't know who Super Commando Dhruv is, he's this guy. How do I point? This guy, this guy in the motorcycle. Yeah, that's Super Commando Dhruv. He's a Raj Comics superhero, and his greatest power is his intelligence. He defeats aliens, gods, all manner of monsters, gangsters, really powerful people, really powerful beings using nothing except his intelligence. He has some gadgets at his disposal, but at the end of the day, all his problems are solved with the application of his mind. And he's not the only character of this kind. In America, there is this character called Batman, who's kind of sort of he occupies the same kind of space as far as heroes go. He is also a person who solves problems with his brain, and that is his primary thing. He plans, he thinks, he solves problem. He basically applies intelligence. Why am I talking about Super Commando Dhruv? The reason I'm talking about Super Commando Dhruv has to do with his name, obviously. Dhruv is an Indian name. Dhruv is a Hindu name, but for all practical purposes and for the purposes of this video, I'm going to at least start my argument by referring to the word Dhruv as an Indian name. And that is at the core of what I wanted to talk about. Because when I was a child, a lot of stories that I was getting to read or watch had heroes who were going on extraordinary adventures. But a lot of these people were not Indian. In fact, they were not even people of color, they were white. I'm talking about Flash Gordon or Spider Man or Superman or Batman or the world is your oyster. Think about all the characters that you read about as a child and then compare their skin tones. They were all white. And more importantly, as far as my perspective as an Indian person is concerned, they all had names that were not Indian names. They had names like Bruce or Clark or Kate or Peter. Now, I am aware that there are people with those names in India, but you have to look at these characters as what they looked like to me at that point of time in my life. I was young and I did not live in a diverse neighborhood. So even if there were people who with names like Bruce and Clark out there, I did not know about it. And in any case, the cities that these characters inhabited, they were nothing like the places that I had seen in my life. They had high rise buildings, they had clean roads, and all the roads are full of cars, etc. I lived in a place where, if I was lucky, I got to see a couple of bicycles in the course of one evening, and there were a lot of trees. So that was nice. When I started writing, in fact, when anyone starts writing, the first thing they do is that they write what they have seen. When I was writing stories about extraordinary adventures, the characters to whom these extraordinary adventures were happening were people with names like Bruce, Clark, and Peter. And these characters were living in places that looked like the places that I saw in these animated series or the comic books that I was reading. They had high rise buildings and they had cars on the road, despite the fact that I did not encounter a high rise building until I was well into my 20s. The first high rise building I saw was in Chennai in the year 2005, I think. I was already an adult at that point of time. For the most part, the only high rise buildings I saw were on television in Hindi and English films. So, when I was writing short stories about characters in these extraordinary places as a child, my imagination was being fed completely by what I had consumed. Because that sort of thing I did not see happening around me. Because I did go to school, I was able to reproduce the appearance of a school in the stories that I wrote because I had seen a school. But I had no idea what a high rise building, how a high rise building functions, or how a city functions. So everything I knew about a city came from what I had read in novels, animated series, and comic books. And that is what happened to my characters and their names also. The reason this video is called How Super Commando Dhruv Saved My Life is that, at least in that one specific instance, I was able to see a character who was having extraordinary adventures, and that character had an Indian sounding name. So, Super Commando Dhruv saved me by showing me that extraordinary adventures in extraordinary places could be had by a person with an Indian name. In him, I could see myself and people like me. In him, I could see worlds populated by people like me. And that was a huge deal because, as I learned much later when talking to other friends who I made on my way to adulthood, who were also writing fantasy stories, a friend of mine who had grown up reading only American content, only American adventure stories, was unable to write stories featuring people with Indian names because his brain had been programmed right from childhood to think of stories and extraordinary adventures and strange and amazing tales as things that only happened to non Indian people. In fact, one friend of mine even gave me, he told me the way he solved this problem was by writing an entire story with a character name like Keith. And then after the story was done, he used to do a search and replace for Keith and replace it with Karthik. So the story ended up having an Indian character with an Indian name, but he was not able to write the story with an Indian character name because his brain simply didn't process reality that way. One of the things that a company like Raj Comics did to kids my age back in the 90s and in the early 2000s was that it convinced us, it showed us a version of reality where people like us could live in extraordinary worlds and deal with extraordinary realities. If I'm writing fantasy today that has to do with Indian mythology, Indian folklore, etc., then no small part of the credit goes to a character like Super Commando Dhruv. Just by being there, just by standing tall as an Indian character, he made it possible for me to imagine Indian fantasy. And by the way, this is not even me saying that Indian fantasy did not exist. I had, after all, grown up watching Mahabharata and Ramayana on television. These were mythological stories set in India and had characters who had Indian names. But because of the milieu that these stories are set in, because of the age in the time periods that these stories are set in, it was difficult for me to imagine those worlds also as contemporary India. Whenever I thought of a Mahabharata reality, I could perhaps write a story about gods, but they still had to be bare bodied and wearing a dhoti and had to be using bows and arrows or swords and gadas as their tools. So, even though those were Indian realities, they were not contemporary Indian realities the way Super Commando Dhruv's stories were. They were stories where an Indian person was fighting aliens riding on a motorcycle in the streets of an Indian city. It wasn't until I was an adult that I began to understand the kind of influence that these stories had on me when I was a child. And because I was an adult, I also started applying this understanding to other stories that we have all grown up watching and listening to. I'm talking about our primary mythological stories, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. I was talking about them just now, but in a slightly different context. The context that I want to apply that knowledge to is that, imagine a child watching Flash Gordon and then getting influenced into thinking that Flash Gordon like adventures can only happen to people with Flash Gordon like names or skin colors. Now imagine a child who is watching the Ramayana or the Mahabharata as a child, and then coming to the conclusion that mythological adventures can only be had by people with Hindu sounding names. That's also a limiting influence on a child's imagination. If possible, imagine also a child who's watching the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and is affected by the fact that nobody from his caste is able to have the kind of adventures that the heroes of the Ramayana and Mahabharata have. Because let's face it, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are dominant narratives of India, and they are also stories in which the main characters are often upper caste people. They are people who belong to the warrior caste or the priest caste, Brahmins and Kshatriyas. Now, you may argue that there are characters in the Ramayana and Mahabharata who belong to many, many backgrounds, but this point remains that if you were to abridge these stories for easy consumption for a young person, you will have to conclude that the main characters are all from dominant caste backgrounds. The way I watched American TV shows and was unable to find myself reflected in those stories, it's entirely possible. In fact, it's probably entirely real already that there are many people who watch these stories and are unable to find themselves in those stories. In recent times, there has been much talk about representation in the West, particularly in Hollywood, about the importance of people of color being represented in popular entertainment so that children of color, when they consume that entertainment, may be able to see themselves reflected in what they are watching. They may be able to see someone like them having adventures of the sort that so far only white people were having, at least on screen. I mean, nobody is having those adventures. If that was the case, the world would be very different. But even when we are writing stories about those adventures, we are only kind of mostly, not only, mostly showing white people having those adventures. So, representation is a good way for people who do not belong to that cultural background to see themselves on screen and be able to imagine futures that are not white. Black Panther was a good example of this, and there have been other stories also. But my point is that when we look at representation in India, we need to look at it in terms that are different from racial representation because race is not a reality in India the way it is in America. In India, the reality is religion and caste. The reality is socially what we describe as a marginalized community in India is radically different from what America describes as a marginalized community. So when I talk about representation in popular entertainment, I'm talking about the point that when you look at popular cinema, you are more likely to have a main character with a second name Malhotra or Khanna or Pandey or any number of upper caste second names, then you are likely to have someone who belongs to a tribal background. So representation in India has to be different because the way I watched Flash Gordon as a child and came to the conclusion that this kind of a story cannot happen to an Indian person until Super Commando Dhruv saved me from that kind of thinking. That sort of thinking is happening to many Indians right now. Imagine someone who is not Hindu watching and getting blown away by a mythological story. But they are also thinking that this cannot happen to me because my second name is not Hindu. At the end of the day, I think a lot depends on our answer to the question, what is the purpose of a story? And if our answer to that question is that the purpose of a story is entertainment, then we kind of prevent ourselves from getting to a greater realization. And that realization is that stories are operating systems for civilizations. They are the foundation of how people behave with each other and how people identify each other. If a story is not truly representational of everyone who lives in a civilization or wishes to belong to a civilization, then that story is not going to be a great operating system. And in the long run, will be the cause behind much social strife. Because people who are able to find themselves in that story, in India's case, mythological stories, people who are able to see themselves reflected in that story will think of themselves as those who truly belong. And those who are unable to will not be able to justify their existence on that piece of land that civilization calls the nation. However, If a civilization is built on top of stories that are truly representational of everyone who belongs there, then that civilization will prosper because people will be able to point at each other and say, "You belong to me, you are me, I am you. We work for each other, we work together, we do the same things in order to get to the same goal." I think that one of the most important things as far as the growth of a civilization is concerned is that everyone who belongs in a civilization needs to be able to see themselves in the most popular stories that are told in that civilization during that period of time. Because only people who are able to see themselves in these stories will be able to write the stories that become the mythological texts of tomorrow.